Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today I thought we would talk about a subject which, when I was first getting into the Napoleonic Wars and thinking about the period, I didn't really think would be that common, but it actually appears the more you read about it, particularly the late war, the more you see this come into its own. What I thought we'd talk about today is fighting in built-up areas during Napoleonic battles. We'll look at where that happened and how, and then we'll have a look at how it's dealt with in Black Powder and how you can optimize your chances of success both in defense and in assault. Now, for me, when I think of horse and musket warfare, I think of a row of guys firing at another row of guys. Usually one of them's wearing bright red coats, and they're blazing away until the cavalry charge in and put an end to the fight and clean up the day. Now, that did happen, particularly in the 7 Years' War, although there was a lot of trenches and stuff like that before that in the Duke of Marlborough Wars, weirdly so. But in the Napoleonic Wars, while that did happen as the wars went on, often commanders and troops would use built-up areas as strong points, either to anchor their line in defence or in assault. I think perhaps the most famous example, well, not the most famous, but one of the famous early examples of this would be the Battle of Aspern-Essling, in which Napoleon wanted to cross the swollen river, I think it was the Danube, and in order to do so, he had to establish a beachhead on the far side of the river, on the north side of the river. And he did that by sending troops to capture two villages which lay on sort of either side of a slight bend in the river, where the bridge was going to be in the middle. So by taking those two strong points, it meant that their troops could cross the river unmolested, and they'd be absolutely fine, and there'd be no problems at all, because that's exactly how it went down in history. But the idea there was that the two villages would form strong defensive areas from which they could protect the crossing. Now, of course, one of the bonuses about being in built-up areas is they are not so good for cavalry. Cavalry can operate in built-up areas, but not as effectively as infantry. There's always the danger that you're going to be able to fire down upon them, and they are rather limited where they can go. They can only go down the roads, effectively. When you come to urban warfare, you don't even need to necessarily use your muskets. Things like roof tiles and that can be pretty deadly. I think it was Pyrrhus of Epirus was killed by a roof tile thrown, and I think one of the early Caesars was wounded that way as well. So yeah, you don't even need to necessarily use your weapons. There's weapons all around. So cavalry is not particularly good in built-up areas, and that's reflected in Black Powder, where they can't go in built-up areas. And I think that's fair enough. As a general rule, I would say, yeah, that's reasonable. We're going to come on to what built-up areas are in Black Powder a little bit later on. So as the war continues, you can see far more urban combat. As it were, you've got the Battle of Borodino, the French on the sort of the left wing of the French, which would be the northeastern side of the army. They captured the village of Borodino very early on in the battle. The Russian Guard Jaeger were perhaps drunk and asleep, and they were surprised by a swift bayonet assault. You've got the fight in the villages at Leipzig, and then perhaps the most famous of all of these defences of a built-up area happened in the 100 Days campaign. You've got the Battle of Ligny, in which the village itself was fought over quite a bit, and also on the western side of the battlefield, Van Damme's corps, he went through quite a few villages as well. For more on that, see my video on the Prussian army. I think it's part 4, where we talk about the Battle of Ligny. And then, of course, the most famous of all, at Waterloo, the defence of Hougoumont, particularly the main gates. But you've also got the fight through Place Noire and for La Haye Sainte as well. So as the war goes on, you tend to get these more street fight battles, these more urban fighting. Now, one thing I'm not talking about here is something that was particularly popular in the Peninsula, and that was siege warfare. I'm not talking about sieges. This is more to do with there's troops in a village, or maybe a couple of buildings, or maybe even a building, and the enemy are trying to turf them out. In modern warfare, it is perhaps the most difficult type of warfare. Possibly jungle warfare is more so, especially in mountainous terrain. But if it's not jungle warfare, then urban warfare is the most difficult. If you are assaulting a prepared enemy position, we were told that expected casualties are around about 50%. So I remember one of my corporals saying, "Bloody hell, sir, that's like going into the Thunderdome." so there you go. That's how dangerous assaulting urban positions is today, and that's with things like automatic weapons and grenades and all these kind of things that are useful, C4 charges, all this stuff that you can use in modern warfare. In urban combat, they didn't have any of that back in the day, so perhaps I would say that that made it even easier to defend. You could say, well, the defenders didn't have automatic weapons or grenades as well. That's true, but I think on balance, it's easier to defend in those olden days than it is today. Now, before we talk about the rules in Black Powder for being in built-up areas, one thing that I want to point out, and this is a tactical suggestion here, and it's something that I've found myself falling foul of before, is sometimes the allure of a built-up area can be too strong. Sometimes you can see that thing, yeah, I'll put some troops in there, but realistically that stops them participating in the battle. Once you've garrisoned an area, they are stuck in that position. You can get them out, of course, but their role is to hold that objective or that area. Then that's their role for the rest of the game, really. And what that means is that they can be outranged, so your enemy can use artillery against them. We'll talk about more about that in a bit. And they can be pinned in place quite easily. So I would suggest that you don't do it with your absolute elite troops. Now this goes against the course of Waterloo, where the British Foot Guards were the garrison of Hougoumont. That's slightly different, I think. But in general, particularly if you've got somewhere that you're using to anchor your battle line, then I wouldn't put your most elite troops in there. Think, do you actually need to garrison it? You could say, well, I'm garrisoning it not so much for me, but to prevent the enemy from taking it, and that's fair enough. But in that case, you can have troops nearby. You don't necessarily need the troops in there. Once the enemy start advancing, they could perhaps jump into that terrain if you need them to. So my first point of warning would be, just because you see a built-up area doesn't mean that you have to use it. The other thing is, beware of them breaking up your army. Now, there were 2 battles I can think of off the top of my head which were fought in and around built-up areas in which it formed the centre of the battle line. The first one is the one we mentioned earlier on, Linney. That was very much in the centre, although there were a village either side as well, which also took part in the fighting. And the other one is Fuentes de Honoro, where the fight was in the streets of the village of Fuentes de Honoro. Admittedly, on day 2, it moved a bit further south onto the plain as the British extended themselves, but the main fight itself took part in the streets that were in the centre of the British lines. And the reason why this can be a problem is because it splits your force. It means that if you need, for argument's sake, if you're fighting north to south and you've got that village in the middle of your line, then it makes it very difficult for you to move troops from your eastern flank to your western flank and vice versa if the enemy start to assault there. And that's often quite a good tactic to make. If you see a piece of terrain or something like that that splits the enemy force in half, it's often best to mass your troops on one side, and then you can deal with them while they're still negotiating that obstacle. And then when they come through, possibly piecemeal or possibly only half the army all at once, then you can turn and destroy the reinforcements as well. So as I say, be aware of there being terrain that looks good to garrison, but may actually be something of a hindrance. In the case of it splitting your line, you may be best off just advancing beyond it, and then you've got your clear line. Now, it could still be worth garrisoning some troops in there anyway as a reserve, but there you go. Now, why am I talking about this subject? I probably should have started with this, shouldn't I? But here we are, 9 minutes in. I'll bring it up now. We are just under a month away from Under Eagles to Glory, the Napoleonic event that is happening at Boards and Swords, presented by the Napoleonic Wargamer. And there are still a couple of tickets left. It's sold way above my expectations, my wildest dreams. Thank you so much for everyone who's attending, or even thinking of just dropping in to say hi. I'm really looking forward to the weekend. As I say, there are still a couple of tickets available. And the 4th scenario, so the second scenario we're playing on day 2, does deal with defending and attacking built-up areas. So how best to defend a built-up area? This is probably the easiest way of doing it. The easiest way to talk about, far easier than talking about how to assault them, and that is to garrison them with a decent but not too good a unit. So what do I mean by that? Well, we'll take even back even a stage further than that. What do we mean by built-up areas? Now, what we'll be using on the day is a footprint that represents a town or a village, something like that. So we're not going to use individual buildings. It's just going to be a piece of felt that's going to represent the built-up area. You can garrison it with one unit, regardless of the number of buildings, as I say, and that unit should be one that's pretty decent, but not necessarily anything that's absolutely amazing. I mentioned earlier on, I wouldn't use the foot guards. I would just use a normal line regiment. Most units get a 4+ save, and you get a +2 save for being in a built-up area to give you the 2+ save. And that is the maximum you can get. There's no point in putting, say, the Imperial Guard in there, because they start off with a 3+. They get +2, but they realistically only get +1. So they're only getting half the benefit of a line battalion that would be manning those walls. So that is one benefit you get for being in a built-up area. You get +2 to your morale saves. The second one is that you have 360-degree line of sight. Now, you can only fire one shot per facing. You effectively count as a square in this case. So you can only fire one shot per facing. So you're probably going to get one, possibly 2 shots if the enemy are marching around and about you. So again, there's not really much point in having units in there with an extra shot. I'm trying to think of things that would have 4 shots. I can't think of any examples off the top of my head, except for large units. Now, it might be worth putting a large unit in there, but not for its shooting abilities. You're only going to get the, as I say, 1, possibly 2 shots from the different sides of the built-up area. Now, similarly, the absolute worst unit you could garrison a building with is one that doesn't have any shooting at all. Now, I can't think of any in the main Black Powder Napoleonic rules that don't have any shooting. I think pretty much everyone could lug a musket or a pistol about in the the armies of the 19th century. But there may be some units in future supplements, things like Fellaine or the Tyrol Revolters, if they've just got pitchforks and stuff like that, or even possibly something like the Paris National Guard with their pikes, or pike-armed Opolcheni units. There was also, I heard once, Bruce Quarry writes about the unit of Spanish halberdiers that were part of the army. So I don't know if they fought in action. I don't think they did. But yeah, don't garrison your Napoleonic built-up areas with halberdiers would be my recommendation here. And that's purely because if you can't shoot, the enemy can just completely ignore you with no penalty whatsoever. Okay, they get the command penalty, but you could in fact be making things even easier for them because they're going to be able to initiative move if they're within 12 inches of you. So just be careful that your troops that they're not wasting their shooting, but they at least have some shooting. A small unit with only 2 shots could be good enough, but yeah, I mean, it could be good enough, especially if they have a bonus to their shooting. So something like the Austrians, they get an extra shot at point-blank range for the first time, or if you've got sharpshooter, rifles, something like that, a combination of the two, then you can reach out and be a threat to the enemy so they can't ignore you, but you're not wasting too many resources. And that's got to be the key, really, is you need to make it so your enemy can't just ignore you. And we'll come on to that in a bit. So I mentioned there about sharpshooter. The same goes for tough fighter. Now, you know I love me some tough fighter. And the thing I really like about tough fighter is it means that it happens every single turn that you're in combat. So it's not something like Flint Sharpen or First Fire, where once you use it, once it's gone. You have that every single turn. Now, I think one of the best units in the game that you can garrison a building with, and with this should bring all that together. I think one of the best units you can do are Highlanders. They have Tough Fighter. They only have 3 shots. They've got a morale save of 4+, so that goes to a 2+. They're not losing out anything there. Now, one of the things you are missing out with for the British is Ferocious Charge. Is Steady Line. So that is a problem if you're garrisoning a building with the British. But, you know, it's not the end of the world. It just means that you get your +1 to hit when you are being charged effectively. Now, something you'll find when you're in a built-up area is you have a lot of opportunities to fire at close range because most of the enemy units will be moving past you. So there is that as well. One of the questions that we're not sure about, both me and Dan sort of play it different ways depending on how we're feeling, is if you have 1 shot per facing and you have the first fire rule, do you get an extra dice per facing? Do you get an extra dice to that 1 shot? Or do you get an extra dice to the unit, which means that you could fire potentially 4, but only 1 from each facing? I suspect that's probably the best way of doing it, but in which case you'd be effectively wasting it, because you're unlikely to be able to fire in all 4 directions at once. Another unit, potentially a better unit, is Russian Jaeger. Now, I say potentially, and that's because they have the sharpshooter. They've only got 3 shots, but they have that 4th point of stamina. We'll come on to talking about how important that is when we talk about assaulting the built-up areas. The Russians, they suffer -1 to hit from their shooting, so, you know, they can still be a threat, but the enemy can potentially ignore them, which is why I'm tied whether they're the best against the Highlanders or not. Of course, as we mentioned earlier on at Borodino, the Guard Jaegers were not particularly good at holding a built-up area. But there you go. Also, just behind Borodino was the river, which had a bridge over it that was guarded by the Marines of the Guard. So there's a unit that you don't hear very much of, but of the Russian Imperial Guard. So that's something. I've never seen anyone make any models of them. If anyone makes models of the Russian Marines of the Imperial Guard, let me know, and I will buy myself some, and I will buy you some as well. There you go. The other thing with defending built-up areas is this depends on whether you are in your own deployment area, if you're in the midst of your army, or if you're a bit of an outlier. Expect to be on your own until the cavalry can ride to the rescue, quite literally in this case. If you've got some medium or heavy cavalry, you can use them to take away the assaults on the building. Again, we're going to talk about how to get the most out of assaulting a built-up area. So you can use them there, but you've got to be able to look after yourself for a while, which is where the extra stamina comes in. That's why I wouldn't necessarily go for a small unit. I would tend to go for a medium or a large one, depending on what the criteria for your built-up area is. I think this is a good time to point out as well that for most large built-up areas, so if we're looking at Fuentes d'Onoro, for argument's sake, or Ligny, or even Hougoumont to an extent, I would tend to split it up into smaller chunks. Now, this is something that's going to be important when you're writing the scenario or when you're coming up with a scenario. And it's something that's difficult to appreciate until I think you've played it a few times, is that it takes a long time to get a unit out of a built-up area. If you want to, I mean, we're talking 6 or 7 turns perhaps. So if you're going to make the village take 18 turns, potentially 20, 25 turns to take, well, that might be too much. So you might just want to split it into 2 or find another way of doing it. Maybe if you're attacking a built-up area from the built-up area next to it, you don't get defensive bonuses, something like that. But just be aware, we're in for the long haul when assaulting a built-up area. So if you're going to divide your areas into several built-up areas, you have to multiply the amount of turns it's going to take by the areas that you split it up into. So obviously, the more you split it up to, it's going to really snowball how long that game's going to go on for, or how long the attacker's going to have to achieve their objective. So just be aware of that. If the whole battle is around taking Hougoumont or something like that, then that's not necessarily the end of the world. But just remember the rest of the battle is going to be going on around this smaller clash that you've got. So that is enough burying of the lead. Let's get into the options, the tactics, the strategies for assaulting those built-up areas. Now, this is going to kind of follow on from the last point, really. The first one is, it is going to take a long old time, a long time, in order for you to take these built-up areas. Now, it may not do. It may take one round of combat. Huzzah. It's unlikely, though. And by unlikely, I mean very, very unlikely. And that is because the enemy count as being in a square, effectively. So it means that they can't support or be supported, but it does mean that they get +2 to their combat results. Now, because they have no flanks or rear, you can't get bonuses from that, but you can still get your static combat reds. So you can defeat that by having 2 support to both your flanks and your rear. Now you're taking up 4 units to take 1 built-up area, and you're still unlikely to do it in 1 round of combat. We'll get to that for why in a second. But you've now effectively used a whole brigade to take what is an area garrisoned by 1 enemy battalion. Now, this is not necessarily historically inaccurate. We do say today that you need numbers of 3 to 1. I actually think these days they say 5 to 1 in order to take a built-up area. So, that's not actually beyond the realms of historical accuracy there. But the reason is you're going to start off, let's say you have full support. So you've got a unit to each of your flanks and your rear. You're on +3. Your opponent's on +2, so effectively you're on +1. You then have the combat that you're going to fight. Now, the enemy only rolls 2 dice. So, they're going to hit on a 4, because they're not going to get any charging bonuses. And they may do a casualty. So, they hit on a 4, you're saving on a 4, they might do a casualty. If we're going to be mathematically correct about it, they have a 25% chance of causing a casualty. You, on the other hand, you charge in with your mighty 6 attacks. And you hit on 3s, so you should hit on average 4 of those. And then the enemy takes their saving throws of 2+. So you may get one that goes through. You're unlikely to, though. So let's say it doesn't go through. So it just goes on the combat res. We've won by 1, so the enemy has to take a combat result test. They ignore any roll of a 5+ on 2 dice. So, they could still roll a 2, 3, or 4, and the unit disappears. They will do that 1 time in 12. So, there is the chance that's going to happen, but I certainly wouldn't rely on it. And that's even if you win the combat in the first place. Now, unlike the garrisoning of a built-up area, I would be tempted to send your better troops in to clear a garrison out. That's because the more dice you roll, the more saves the enemy has to take, unless you roll like me, and the more likely they are to roll a 1. The thing with taking the built-up area is it's all about the grind. It's all about just slowly whittling the enemy unit that's in the built-up area down. What I would also suggest as a rule of thumb is you will probably need to assault with a 2nd unit. Now, this is possibly even a 3rd unit, depending on if you can get round them on 3 sides. Now, this is where we come into, normally I would say you want to maximize your static combat resolution. Here I would say no, you want to throw those supporting troops into the assault, preferably from, well, not absolutely, because you could only assault 1 unit per direction at a time. So, you're going to have to go in from different facings. And the idea here is, again, that you're maximizing the number of dice roll. If you roll 6 dice, the enemy might fail 1 saving throw. If you roll 18 dice, then they may fail 3. And this is the crucial part. This is why I say before, I think the Russians might be in the running for the best garrison unit. That's because you need to get your enemy to their break point. You need to get them shaken in order to really think about breaking them, because they do take the negative morale modifiers for excess casualties. That's the only one they take, excess casualties. So you need to maximize the number of excess casualties you're causing, which means that you need to get the number of hits in first. Now, there's two ways you can do this. One is in assault, and the other is with the shooty shoot. Now, the best way of doing it with shooting is, of course, with artillery. This is where artillery really shines. The enemy get +2 to their saving throw. Artillery at medium range gives them -2 to their saving throw as well. So you can wheel the guns up and start blazing away, and their benefit for being in cover is negated by your artillery. Alternatively, you can get into point blank range. Now, at that range, you're going to be receiving fire. You're going to be receiving fire from the enemy, but they're only rolling 1 dice. Okay, they're going to hit you on a 3+, but they're rolling 1 dice. They're going to hit you on a 3+. You've then got your save, so you may be okay. Now, if you fail your leadership test, then it's going to be sad times for you. But because the enemy are in the building, you know there's no danger of them assaulting you. So you can basically wheel up the cannons to the front door and start blazing away. It's best if you do it with horse artillery, because they can unlimber and fire in the same turn. But, if you don't mind taking a turn of firing from 1 dice, then it may be worth rolling up that foot artillery and doing the same thing. Particularly if it's something like guard artillery, they've got a 3+ save as well, so the chances are that they're going to be okay. Speaking of artillery, you can always go the General Andy route, and that is to use your howitzers to set fire to the built-up area. Now, this is a bit of a risky maneuver. There are rules for it in Black Powder. Effectively, you roll a dice, and you see how intense the fire is. The enemy then can spend, I think it's up to 3 turns, trying to match or beat that roll. If they can't, then the whole place is considered a blaze, and it has to be evacuated. That's probably the best way of getting the enemy out of a built-up area, but not if you want to control that built-up area. If that's the built-up area that's in the center of an enemy line, it's absolutely perfect, because you can set fire to the town and then it becomes impassable. Now, again, I'm going back to my part 4 on the Prussian army. Anyone who's listened to that will know that a burning town does stop troops marching through it. At the end of the Battle of Linny, they basically had to wait for the village to burn itself out before the old guard could march through it, which, as I said at the time, must have looked absolutely crazy. You got this whole town on fire, and then you just hear like the rhythmic beating of the drums, Vive l'Empereur! And then these 6-foot tall dudes come out of the smoke in bearskins. That must have been terrifying. But anyway, yeah, so that's the other way that you can get rid of an enemy garrison, is just to smoke it out. Now, it is a little, you've got to be lucky. You've got to roll high. Well, you've got to set fire to it in the first place. Then you've got to roll high on the fire intensity number, effectively. So, but you pay your money, you take your choice. If you're firing with artillery anyway, well, that's just an additional bonus. Again, I wouldn't rely on it. I'd prep the area with artillery, then send the infantry in. If you can take 1 or 2 points of stamina off the enemy before you send your assault in, then you're going to be in a much, much stronger position, and it's going to take a lot less time for that assault to be successful. Speaking of assaulting, the other thing you can do is add an element of engineers to your unit. Now, in the Under Eagles to Glory, your vignette can be engineers if you want it to be. If it is, then you get the bonus. Now, with one of the missions definitely including built-up areas, it's not necessarily the worst idea in the world. Now, you can also buy a base for your army as well as part of your army selection. That is in a Clash of Eagles, and it is 25 points to add engineers to one of your battalions. So this would effectively give you 2. If you're using the French Imperial Guard army list, you can also have the engineers of the Guard, so you can have up to 3 engineer units. But for most mere mortals, it'll be 1 or 2. I would suggest that you upgrade at least one of your battalions to have some engineers. But yeah, I mean, it's up to you. The vignette you may find useful to bring something else. I will probably be bringing an apothecary wagon myself. But anyway, so yes, the engineers, they basically negate the enemy's advantage for being in buildings. Similar to the artillery, they stop the +2 to their save, although the artillery just blasts straight through it. Now, this is useful because it Well, it is useful and it's not useful. Obviously, it's mega useful because the enemy doesn't get that 2+ save. And that's what they're relying on to keep them alive, really. They don't have the supports. They don't have the static res, except for the +2 for being in effectively square. So it means that they're not going to get many kills. By stripping away their saving throw, you're going to, A, get them to their stamina point. You're going to shake them much quicker, and then you're going to break through them. I would recommend that you're probably looking at 2 to 3 turns with some engineers to take out a unit that could take you at least double that without the engineers. So definitely think about including those guys in your army. Also, it allows you to use some sweet models in your collection as well. I know that not all the models come with, not all the figure manufacturers do boxes with pioneers in their units, but you can certainly add them. There are companies that do. I know Front Rank sell them separately, as do Eagle Miniatures. The old Victrix Command set had a pioneer in, and the more recent Perry sets, they have pioneers on their command sprues as well. One last thing that I should say, that I just want to quickly talk about, is should you use artillery to garrison a building? I wouldn't if it's going to be attacked. Now, they could transport artillery onto rooftops and things like that. They would use a crane to lift them up there. But if you lose a combat, no matter what the morale roll is, the artillery will break. So if it's a built-up area deep within your lines, then yeah, I'd say go large. Yeah. If it's in the center of the table, or maybe even in near the enemy's deployment zone, absolutely don't use artillery to garrison. They just don't have the staying power, I'm afraid. And that is it, a quick run through urban warfare in Black Powder. It is very easy to garrison buildings that don't necessarily bring anything to your army, but it's always hard to throw that enemy garrison out, unless you've got engineers. As happened at Waterloo, these fights can be quite go on for a long time and suck troops in like a black hole. They can pull troops in. Suddenly you're wanting to charge from 2 or 3 sides, and you want those units supported. So suddenly, what you assigned 1 battalion to do, you're now using 6, 7, 8 battalions to do. So it's very easy to get fixated on taking these built-up areas. If you are having a mission where you want them to be central to the battle, you've got to allow time for that to happen. And equally, if you want it to be just you want a village on the table because it looks good, well, you want to make sure that it doesn't dominate the fighting too much either. As I say, this advice will be very useful for Under Eagles to Glory. If you have a ticket, then it's less than a month away. I can't believe it. I'm really looking forward to seeing everyone there. If you just want to pop in, then that is you are more than welcome. We'd love to see you. And I'm just looking now. The date is Saturday the 22nd and Sunday the 23rd of June. It's basically the weekend after the Waterloo anniversary. That's on the Tuesday that week. So please come along, even if you're not taking part. I really look forward to seeing you there. And we'll have a chat about all things Napoleonic. It's going to be good fun. Well, thank you very much for listening, and I will speak to you guys next time.